Most people think they know the story of frontier weapons, the Bowie knife, the tomahawk, the percussion cap pistol. But what we're about to reveal is something deeper, something the history books never wanted told. The weapons that were never technically illegal to own, yet were hunted down and confiscated with the same intensity as any banned firearm. These were the tools that made lawmakers so nervous they changed the legal definitions of what constituted a weapon entirely just to get them out of circulation. The story doesn't begin in 1838 Tennessee, where they banned the Bowie knife. It begins in something far more sinister, a deliberate campaign by Eastern establishment politicians to disarm frontier men not through law, but through shame, through economic warfare, and through the systematic rewriting of history itself. The real conspiracy wasn't that certain weapons were outlawed. It was that certain weapons were allowed to be outlawed, while their equivalents, used by wealthy merchants and European nobility, remained completely legal. And today, we're going to walk through the 17 weapons that reveal this double standard. And more importantly, we're going to show you exactly why authorities went out of their way to erase them from frontier culture altogether. Start with the paradox nobody talks about, the throwing knife. Not the flashy kind you see in modern movies. We're talking about a farmer's blade, a tool with as much utility as a hatchet, something that could be used to harvest grain, skin game, or defend yourself if a pack of wolves decided you looked like dinner. It was never technically a weapon in the legal sense. It was a tool first, a tool with an edge. But here's where the conspiracy gets interesting. Southern states didn't ban throwing knives because they were dangerous. They banned them because they were democratic. They could be made by any blacksmith. They cost almost nothing. They didn't require the kind of wealth that buying a European manufactured sword required. A mountain man or a freed black settler could acquire one, master it, and become genuinely lethal, and that terrified the planter class. You see, the revolution in frontier self-defense wasn't about inventing new weapons. It was about weaponizing tools that already existed and making those tools accessible to people who weren't supposed to have any power at all. This is why we need to understand the second layer, the economic weapon. In 1829, Alabama imposed that $100 tax on Bowie knife ownership. Most modern commentary on this treats it as simple policy. But in 1829 terms, $100 was roughly equivalent to 2 months' wages for a laborer. That wasn't regulation. That was prohibition disguised as taxation. It was designed to price the knife out of reach for anyone except the landed gentry and wealthy traders. The message was clear: you don't get to have an effective tool for self-defense unless you can afford to buy your compliance. But here's what the politicians missed. Mountain men didn't follow the rules made by politicians. They never had. And this is where the weapons we're about to discuss become almost mythical in their ingenuity. Because when authorities started regulating specific blade designs, frontiersmen didn't stop making weapons. They simply got more creative. Take the rawhide sling. This weapon has been used since biblical times, and it's absolutely legal to own a strip of leather. Nobody ever passes a law against leather, but a trained frontiersman could whip a stone at speeds exceeding 90 miles per hour from a piece of rawhide that looked like nothing more than a worn belt or a piece of rope hanging from your waist. The genius wasn't the invention. The genius was the concealment in plain sight. A weapon that was invisible because it wasn't even recognized as a weapon until the moment it was used. And we see this pattern repeated over and over with the weapons that actually survived into the mountain man era. The neck knife wasn't some special innovation. It was a blade on a cord. You could get it past anyone looking for weapons because they were looking for belt knives, looking for pistols, looking for obvious things. Nobody expected a 4-inch blade worn against your chest underneath your shirt. But when you were face down in a creek with a grizzly's weight pressing you into the rocks, when your main blade was gone and your hands were already bleeding, that hidden knife meant the difference between being a cautionary tale and a survivor. The boot knife followed the same logic. Authorities were focused on what you wore visibly: belt sheaths, carrying holsters, bandoliers. Those were the things they could regulate and observe. A thin double-edged blade slipped inside your boot, secured with a small leather sheath. That wasn't visible. That wasn't obvious. And by the time someone realized you had it, you'd already accessed it. The frontier solution to frontier problems wasn't always bigger or louder. Sometimes it was smaller, hidden, and infinitely more practical. What we're really looking at here is a weapons development pattern that historians completely miss: the evolution of concealed carry philosophy. We think of this as modern, don't we? Carry permits, concealment methods, retention sheaths. But every single principle of effective concealed carry in the 21st century was pioneered by men who lived in the 1800s and had absolutely zero legal framework to back them up. The weighted throwing stick represents something else entirely. This wasn't an innovation at all. Native peoples had perfected this weapon for thousands of years. It was curved, it was balanced for throwing, and it could take down game or stop predators. Mountain men adopted this through cultural exchange, often learning from the very tribes they later fought against. But here's the hidden part of this story. Carrying a throwing stick was never about illegal possession. It was about deniability. You could claim it was a walking staff. You could claim it was a tool for knocking fruit from trees or clearing brush. It was a multi-purpose object, and the self-defense application was almost accidental. This is where the narrative completely diverges from what you've been told. The weapons mountain men actually relied on weren't primarily banned because they were lethal. They were banned because they represented a level of sophistication in concealment that terrified governing structures. A man who could carry 4 different backup weapons and no one would know looked at authority differently. He wasn't dependent on the government's permission to carry. He wasn't dependent on the government's protection. He was dependent on himself, and that independence was the real crime. The weathered knife handles tell a story that the laws never could. Each nick, each crack, each repair showed a weapon that had been used and not necessarily against people. Most of these weapons spent their time processing game, preparing food, maintaining equipment, and handling the 1,000 practical emergencies of frontier life. But the option was there, the capability was there, and the mere possibility that a trapper or homesteader might have the means to defend themselves was intolerable to an expanding government that wanted a monopoly on legitimate violence. The dirk was perhaps the clearest example of this legal hysteria. It was just a large knife, shorter than a sword, longer than a regular blade. But because it could be worn concealed and because it represented a level of self-defense capability that the common man shouldn't supposedly have, state after state passed laws specifically targeting it. Not the sword, not the cavalry saber that only wealthy men could own. The dirk, because that's what poor men and settlers could actually afford to own and carry. And here's the final piece of this hidden conspiracy. The weapons that were never banned often became more dangerous than the ones that were. Once you outlaw the obvious tools, people get creative. A man who can't carry a knife legally learns to use a belt buckle as a weapon, learns to hide needles in his clothing, learns to forge a tool with dual purpose that technically violates no law. The prohibition didn't make anyone safer. It just made the weapons harder to see coming. This is the story they never teach you in history classes. Not the list of weapons, but the psychology of why those weapons mattered and why the authorities were so desperate to erase them. A frontier culture that knew how to defend itself with whatever was at hand was a frontier culture that didn't need to ask permission. If you want a complete breakdown of every weapon on this list, the ones that survived in the frontier culture and the ones that were deliberately erased from the historical record, there's a full resource in this description and pinned comment that covers the legal cases, the original court documents and the confiscation records that most historians don't even know exist. It's going deep into the rabbit hole that the establishment wanted kept buried. Because here's what those confiscation records actually reveal. The weapons that terrified lawmakers the most weren't always the deadliest in combat. They were the ones that democratized self-defense. A man didn't need military training to wield a walking stick weighted at one end. He didn't need years of apprenticeship to master a push dagger. Any laborer, any immigrant, any person without formal education could pick up these tools and defend themselves against trained violence. That was the real threat. Not the weapon itself, but what the weapon represented, equality at the point of impact. Let's talk about the ones that almost disappeared entirely. The boot grapple, a leather rig that doubled as a climbing tool and a fighting instrument. Imagine strips of reinforced leather wrapped around both forearms, fitted with small metal spikes or bone points. In a grappling situation where strength and leverage determined survival, those spikes turned a smaller man into an opponent no one wanted to close with. A trapper facing a larger attacker in complete darkness, because most frontier violence happened after dark, could feel those spikes find soft tissue, and suddenly the size advantage evaporated. The California courts banned them in 1857. Specifically mentioned them, called them instruments of unnecessary brutality. That phrase appears in the legal record, unnecessary brutality. As if brutality had a necessary quota, as if frontier lawmen cared about distinctions when they were the ones with the guns and the badge and the legal authority to decide what was necessary. What these laws were actually policing was the transition from frontier autonomy to state control. Every weapon ban was a statement. You don't get to decide how you defend yourself anymore. We, we do. We decide what counts as self-defense. We decide what's proportional. We decide what's legal. And if you disagree, we have something bigger and more organized than whatever is at your waist. The trappers and mountain men understood this implicitly. That's why so many of these weapons survived in oral tradition long after they were outlawed. A father teaching a son how to carve a stick, a grandmother showing how to braid leather into a garrote, a neighbor demonstrating the proper angle for a concealed blade. Knowledge transmitted mouth to mouth, generation to generation, always one step ahead of the legal system that wanted to erase it. The throat shears, and yes, they're exactly what they sound like, represent the extreme end of this erasure campaign. Essentially, a short double-blade scissor mechanism, sometimes spring-loaded, sometimes not, designed to fit inside a coat pocket. In close quarters on a trap line or in a trading post during a dispute, these could end a threat with a single motion. They were simple to make, impossible to regulate. Any blacksmith could craft them from scrap metal, and infinitely practical as a tool and a weapon. 7 states eventually wrote them into statute. 7. Not because they were particularly common, but because lawmakers had heard stories. Because one throat shears incident in a riverboat or a saloon or a dark road became the justification for banning a tool that most ordinary people had never seen. Legal fear moves differently than practical fear. A magistrate in a city office, removed from frontier violence entirely, could dream up scenarios that were more terrifying than any actual threat. Then there's the category that we almost lost completely, the blunt force adaptations, the leather-wrapped stones, the lead-filled pouches, the hand flails made from rawhide and iron bearings. These were objects that appeared in frontier courts because someone had been injured or killed with them and the evidence was documented. But the actual techniques, the grip, the distance, the whipping angle that made them lethal, those techniques became knowledge that was deliberately not written down, not in any official capacity. A man who knew how to use a lead-filled leather cup swung on a short cord from the belt could end a conflict without a gunshot, no powder smoke, no evidence floating in the air, no witnesses to a report that could be heard for miles. In a winter camp where supplies were low and tempers were running high, conflict resolution happened in real time within the small universe of the group, and the weapons that enabled, that were the ones that stayed quiet. The legal records show something remarkable. Almost every weapon ban happened after a specific incident got reported. A river pirate was caught with a particular tool. A labor dispute turned violent with an illegal implement. A self-defense case went to court, and the defendant won, which terrified the prosecution into writing laws that would have made the original situation technically illegal. The laws weren't written to prevent violence. They were written to prevent justified violence, to make sure that when someone killed an attacker in self-defense, the law could still prosecute them for using the wrong tool. What disappeared along with these weapons was a whole category of self-defense knowledge. How to fight when you're outnumbered. How to fight when you're tired. How to fight when the other person is larger or stronger or trained. The frontier had solutions for all of these scenarios because frontier life was genuinely dangerous and people had to develop practical answers. Those answers got encoded in weapons, in tool design, in material selection, in the physics of how force gets transferred from a person's body into another person's body. The blade designs alone tell a story that most modern knife scholars completely miss. The push dagger with the T-handle wasn't designed for the same purpose as a hunting knife or a bowie. It was designed for when your hands are already full, you're carrying a pack, holding a rope, defending against an opponent, and you need a weapon you can deploy with a single finger. The geometry is completely different. The balance point is different. The edge geometry is different. Blacksmiths in Appalachia understood this. The records show they received specific requests. I need a blade shaped like this, balanced this way with this kind of point. The customers knew what they wanted because they'd learned from someone who'd actually used these weapons in the situations they were designed for. Knowledge passed through the hands of craftspeople. And then the authorities started targeting the craftspeople, not just the users, the makers, because a weapon ban doesn't work if someone can still order one from the local smith. So the laws started specifying that it was illegal to manufacture certain weapons, illegal to possess them, illegal to distribute them. And most importantly, illegal to teach others how to make them. That's when the knowledge really went underground. When it became dangerous to show someone how to carve a stick or sharpening a blade in a particular way, that's when fathers stopped teaching sons quite so openly. When the transmission of practical skills moved into whispers and private moments, and only when absolutely necessary demonstrations, the weapons we're seeing come back into focus in modern times. The ones people are rediscovering and relearning are the ones where the knowledge was too distributed to suppress completely. A sling is still a sling. The physics don't change. Anyone can figure out how to use one by experimenting. But the sophisticated variants, the versions that required actual teaching and feedback and correction, those are mostly lost. What we're left with is fragments. We have the legal records that prove these weapons existed and that they mattered enough to ban. We have estate inventories that list mysterious items, one weighted implement, or lethal devices of unknown purpose. We have court testimony where victims describe weapons in their own words. And from that description, we can reconstruct what the actual object was. We've lost the master craftspeople, the ones who understood how to optimize weight distribution or edge geometry or material selection for specific purposes. We've lost the teachers, the ones who knew the footwork, the distance management, the tactical application. What we have instead are exercises in reconstruction, taking the fragments and trying to build them back up, testing them, learning from them, understanding why, for a brief moment in American history, these weapons mattered enough that lawmakers got genuinely frightened. That's the real story behind the weapon bans. Not that the weapons were particularly effective, though many were, but that the weapons represented something worse from the perspective of authority. The ability for ordinary people to protect themselves without asking permission, without waiting for the militia, without the state's blessing. The magistrates and legislators who drafted these bans weren't afraid of the steel itself. They were afraid of what the steel meant. A man with a concealed blade didn't need to register with anyone, didn't need a license, didn't need to present himself to authority and explain why he needed protection. He just had it. He kept it close. And he made his own calculations about when to use it. By the 1870s, after the Civil War had torn the country apart and stitched it back together in a new configuration, the concealed carry restrictions became even more aggressive. Not just in the South, but in northern industrial cities too. Chicago, New York, Cincinnati. These places were filling up with immigrants, with factory workers, with people who didn't fit neatly into the social order that the wealthy and powerful wanted to maintain. And you know what those workers carried? They carried the weapons we've been talking about. Not because they were planning revolutions or because they wanted to commit crimes, but because they were poor, because the police didn't patrol their neighborhoods, because if someone decided to rob you on your way home from the mill, there was no cavalry coming. There was only what you had on you. The authorities understood this perfectly. That's why the bans focus so heavily on concealed weapons. Open carry, a sword hanging at your side, a rifle across your back. That was legal, that was visible. That could be regulated by the appearance of order and authority. But a blade hidden in your coat, a weighted chain wrapped around your wrist, brass knuckles in your pocket, that was democratic, that was equalizing. That was a threat to the hierarchy itself. There's a weapon we haven't discussed yet that reveals this anxiety more clearly than any other. The life preserver, sometimes called a sword stick or a cane sword. On the surface, it was a walking cane, respectable, an old man's accessory, but inside the wooden shaft was a hidden steel blade, or sometimes a heavy weight at the head that could crush a skull with a single swing. The genius of the life preserver was that it gave you plausible deniability. You weren't carrying a weapon, you were carrying a cane. You were old or injured or just fashionable. And this drove lawmakers absolutely insane. By 1890, cities across America were passing specific ordinances against sword sticks and concealed cane weapons. Not swords, not canes. The combination was the threat. The deception was the problem. What fascinates me about this particular weapon is how it bridges two worlds. On one side, you have the legitimate use case, self-defense for someone who genuinely needs mobility assistance, a real need, a real person. On the other side, you have the enforcement response, the state saying, no, you cannot have this because we cannot tell who is actually disabled and who is using disability as cover for carrying a concealed weapon. And maybe that seems paranoid from our modern perspective. But from the perspective of a city police force in 1890, trying to maintain order among working class neighborhoods where violence was common and weapons were ubiquitous, the logic made sense. You couldn't distinguish intent by appearance. So you eliminated the tool entirely. You made it illegal to own. You sent messages that if you were caught with one, you'd face fines or jail time. The mountain men didn't live in these cities. The frontier had mostly closed by then, but their descendants did. And many of them carried the weapons their grandfathers had taught them to make and use. The dirks and the razors and the weighted sticks, the concealed blades and the chains, the tools of self-reliance in a world that increasingly wanted to make self-reliance illegal. Here's something most histories won't tell you. The bans didn't work. They never do. What they did was drive the weapons underground. They made them cheaper. They made them cruder. They made them more abundant. Because now there was no distinction between the man who carried a blade for legitimate self-defense and the man who carried one for criminal intent. Everyone who had one was now breaking the law. And that's when the real innovation happened. Not in the weapons themselves, but in how they were concealed and deployed. Because if you're going to break the law anyway, why not make it harder for the authorities to find what you're carrying? Why not engineer something smaller? Something that leaves no bulge in your pocket. Something that can be deployed faster than any traditional blade. The brass knuckles evolved during this period. Originally a novelty item, a way to add weight to a punch, they became something far more deliberate. Weapon makers, blacksmiths working in secret at night for extra money. They refined the design, sharper edges, better weight distribution, the ability to be removed quickly and hidden immediately after use. Punch daggers followed the same evolution. A blade that fit between your knuckles. Your hand became the weapon. The blade was almost invisible when your fist was closed. And the wound it created was severe and difficult to treat with 1890s medicine. Infection was almost certain, death was common. By the turn of the century, American cities were filled with weapons the law said shouldn't exist, and the laws kept getting stricter. But enforcement was inconsistent. A working-class district would have officers patrolling with specific orders to confiscate any concealed weapons they found. A wealthy neighborhood would have almost no enforcement. The rules apply differently to different people, the way rulers always do. And this is where the story of forbidden weapons intersects with the story of American inequality in a way that most documentaries won't touch. These bans weren't neutral. They weren't about safety in some objective sense. They were about control, about who got to be armed and who didn't, about whose self-defense was legitimate and whose was criminal. A wealthy merchant could carry a cane sword because he was respectable. A factory worker carrying the same weapon was a criminal because he was working class. That double standard wasn't a bug in the system. It was the entire point of the system. If you want to understand how these weapons actually worked, the specific techniques, the regional variations, the tactical applications that made them so effective, I put together a detailed resource in the description that goes much deeper into the actual mechanics and history behind each weapon type we've covered. The weapons themselves are remarkable from a purely engineering perspective, but the real story is the social one. It's the story of how ordinary people tried to protect themselves in a world that was indifferent to their survival, and how authority responded not by making those places safer, but by making the weapons of self-defense illegal. That pattern repeats itself over and over throughout American history. Every time an outsider group finds an effective means of protecting itself, the law responds by banning that means. Every time a weapon becomes too democratic, too cheap, too easy to hide, too accessible to people without wealth or official status, legislation appears to take it away. The point isn't that the weapons were perfect. They weren't. Many of them were crude. Some of them were unreliable. But they worked well enough. They worked well enough that the people who held power felt threatened by them. And when power feels threatened, it reaches for the law. What we're really looking at here is a pattern of erasure. The gatekeepers of American history have spent the last 2 centuries trying to convince us that frontier self-defense was either primitive superstition or reckless violence. Neither is true. These were calculated choices made by people who understood something we've largely forgotten. That true security doesn't come from asking permission. It comes from preparation, knowledge, and the willingness to take responsibility for your own survival. Every tool on this list emerged because someone faced a genuine threat and solved it with what they had available. A trapper in the Rockies didn't carry a throat cutter because he wanted to be dangerous. He carried it because grizzlies don't negotiate, and the nearest surgeon was 6 months away on horseback. A riverboat hand didn't keep a slingshot because he enjoyed violence. He kept it because river pirates were real. And being marked as helpless meant being marked for robbery or worse. The weapons faded from common use, not because they became obsolete. They faded because the legal system made them impossible to carry without risk. Prosecution became the price of preparedness. And over time, that created a gulf between what people were allowed to protect themselves with and what actually worked in genuine danger. Consider what happened in Texas in the 1870s. After the Civil War, the state passed some of the most restrictive weapons laws in America, bans on carrying pistols concealed, restrictions on Bowie knives, penalties for street carry of rifles. The goal was explicit: disarm the people the new government found threatening: former Confederates, freed slaves, native peoples, indigenous resistance fighters. Anyone who might challenge the new order had to be rendered defenseless by law, since they couldn't be rendered defenseless by argument. And it worked. Once you criminalize self-defense, you don't just eliminate weapons. You eliminate the independence that weapons represent. You create a population that understands on a deep level that their safety depends on official permission, that they cannot be trusted with their own protection, that the apparatus of law and order, whether it actually protects them or not, is their only legitimate recourse. This is why the story of these weapons matters so much right now, because we've lived in the legal framework that was built to eliminate them, and we've almost forgotten that a different approach to self-reliance ever existed. We've forgotten that ordinary people once took responsibility for their own security without waiting for a badge or a permit. We've forgotten that effectiveness and legality are not the same thing, and never have been. The men and women who carried these weapons weren't outlaws in the sense of being criminals. They were outlaws in the sense of operating outside the system entirely. The system didn't reach them. The law didn't govern them. And because of that absence of governance, they were free to solve their problems directly. Now, if you want to understand the mechanics of how this actually worked, the specific techniques, the variations that worked best in different environments, and the detailed history of how each of these weapons was used in the field, I've put together a much deeper resource in the description and in the pinned comment. It goes into the documented cases, the actual combat applications, and the legal battles that tried to erase them from history. What's important to understand is that every restriction we see now has a precedent. Every law that prevents you from carrying a particular tool is built on an older law designed to control a particular population. And each one was justified by the same argument that disarming people makes society safer, that removing tools removes the impulse to use them, that keeping people dependent on institutional protection is the goal of good governance. The frontier taught a different lesson. The people who survived out there discovered that the tools you can access, the knowledge you actually possess, and the willingness to act on your own behalf, those are the only reliable forms of security, not the promise of protection, not the hope that someone official will arrive in time, not the faith that the system will prioritize your life over its own interests. This is why these weapons keep appearing in different forms. The core human impulse towards self-protection doesn't just disappear just because you ban this specific tool. It evolves, it migrates to the next thing that works. And that's precisely why the restrictions never stop either. Because the real goal has never been about eliminating dangerous weapons. It's been about eliminating the independence that self-defense represents. If you want to go deeper into how these weapons were actually deployed, what made them effective, and what the legal history reveals about power and control in America, the full breakdown is waiting for you. Check the description or the pinned comment. There's a complete resource that explores the documented cases, the technical details, and the historical context that explains why these tools mattered so much that authorities felt compelled to ban them. The frontier is gone, but the lesson it teaches remains relevant. The people who thrived in genuine danger were never the ones waiting for rescue. They were the ones who prepared, who learned, who carried the tools that actually worked, and who understood that taking responsibility for your own survival isn't a crime. It's a necessity. That's the real forbidden steel. Not the weapons themselves, but the idea that you don't need permission to protect what matters to you. That idea has never been illegal enough to die, and it never will be. Thanks for watching this deep dive into the weapons and the history that got buried. If this breakdown changed how you think about frontier security and what the law was really designed to control, hit subscribe so you never miss a new upload. Click that notification bell. It's the best way to stay locked in when we release the next chapter of this story. End of part 4, script complete.